Hello and welcome to the spinal cord lecture. The spinal cord is a very complex structure within the nervous system, and so what I'm going to try to do is to break it down, make it as simple as I can, and help you to get an understanding of how it works. So if you look at the spinal cord, it does, as a job, connect the brain to the body. So let me get my stylus pen ready here. So if you take a look at the brain communicates to the body through the spinal cord, and so it has motor commands that come out, motor neurons that come out and interact with the skin, the glands, muscles, and things like that. So if you take a look that the body communicates through the spinal cord to the brain, so it sends information through sensory receptors all throughout your body, and that spinal cord is the conduit through which all of these messages are going to be sent. So you can, to a degree, think of the spinal cord as like a highway. It's a series of cords that are going to be communication links between the body and the brain and the body. So the spinal cord is going to begin at the foramen magnum right up here. So the foramen magnum is where the spinal cord begins, and then it ends right around the first or second lumbar vertebrae. So as we get down here to these lumbar vertebrae, this is where the spinal cord ends, and then there's extensions of it, little axons that come out, nerves that come out that extend beyond where the spinal cord ends. There are 31 segments to the spinal cord. Each segment has a pair of spinal nerves that come out, and I'll show you a picture of that in the next slide. And two major jobs of the spinal cord would be to conduct nerve impulses, so that connection link between the brain and the body and brain. And then it also, your spinal cord is part of the central nervous system, and it does actually think or process information for you in an involuntary way. So there are spinal reflexes that do occur that are beyond your conscious control. And we'll end this lecture talking about spinal reflexes. So here are your 31 segments. So you have 8 cervical nerves that are going to service the neck muscles, and the arms. We have 12 thoracic nerves that are going to service, as you can see there, your thoracic region of your body. You have 5 lumbar nerves that are going to service your lower back region and even extend down into your legs. And then the sacral and coccygeal nerves are going to service lower regions of the body as well. There are 2 enlargements of the spinal cord. You have the cervical enlargement, and you can see it right here. And so in that area in the cervical area, the spinal cord actually enlarges, and it has more what we call gray matter, or more cells inside of the spinal cord that are going to be processors. And probably the reason that you have that is because you have this plexus of nerves that services the neck and the muscles of the arms, which are numerous. So you have to have a little thicker area to be a processor of all of that information. And then we have a lumbar enlargement as well, which is going to service the pelvis and the lower limbs. So when you get to the lumbar enlargement right here, these nerves are going to be coming out, servicing the pelvic area, and then going down and servicing also the legs. So you need a little bit more processing ability, and you get that when you have that enlargement. In the thoracic region, you don't have an enlargement because the nerves don't have to service but a certain amount of area, and the muscles there are not super sophisticated, quite like your forearm muscles or the numerous leg muscles. All along the way of the spinal cord, if you do a transverse section and look at it from a top view, so if I take a transverse section and then look at it from a top view, you can see that the spinal cord, the gray matter and the white matter, so you can look at the white matter up here and the gray matter right here, they're going to differ in their composition. So if you look at the up here in the cervical region, you have more gray matter than white matter, If you get down into the thoracic region, you have more white matter than gray matter. And you can see there is a thickening when you get into the lumbar region, where you have that lumbar enlargement. You can see a thickening of the gray matter. Now, the gray matter is going to be involved in, so the gray matter is going to be involved, this matter right here, is going to be involved in having cells that process information. So when you look at the processors of the spinal cord, those are the processors of the spinal cord. So that's where the cell bodies of the neurons sit. The white matter that's located right in this region here, all of this white matter are going to be axons that are going to come out of those nerves, and those axons will go up and down. They'll ascend or descend and carry information. So that's kind of like your superhighway part right there that carries information is through that white matter, through the axons of the white matter. You can't get a full appreciation of the complexity of the spinal cord looking at this particular graphic here, but it does give you a sense of how it differs depending upon if you're in the cervical area or if you're in the thoracic area or the lumbar area. So more gray matter for sensory and motor control of limbs is why this particular portion up here is thicker, and more gray matter and sensory motor control of limbs for your lower limbs, that's why the gray matter is thicker in this particular region. Okay, this is not a super detailed diagram of the spinal cord, but it gives you a sense of some of the parts. So let me go over a few of the parts with you anatomically. So this is a transverse section. So basically you cut the spinal cord in a transverse section and you're looking at it from the top view, and it gives you a general idea of what's involved here. A couple of landmarks. You always want to know what the posterior and the anterior regions are. So up here you have the posterior median sulcus. It's a little groove in the posterior side, back side of the spinal cord. And in the front you have the anterior median fissure. The anterior median fissure is a deeper groove. That's why we call it a fissure. It's a deeper groove through the spinal cord in the anterior region. This particular piece of spinal cord comes from C3, so we're looking at a cervical nerve, the cervical region. And a couple of other details here. You have your white matter. The white matter is going to be the part that has the axons of the axons from the cells coming out of the gray matter, and of course we have over here the gray matter, and that is the actual cell bodies. We have the central canal. The central canal is going to be full of cerebral spinal fluid and is continuous with the ventricles of the brain, so you have a nourishing fluid inside of that central canal. And a couple of things coming out of the spinal cord here would be the posterior or dorsal root. So you may want to write dorsal down there because you know, some books have dorsal, and I'll even interchange dorsal and posterior root, but this is kind of like the main root of nerves coming out of the posterior side. We have over here the anterior or ventral root that you can see over here. Let me see if I can get a highlight here. So this is going to be the anterior or ventral root, and that's going to be all the processes coming out of the spinal cord in the front region. We have here a spinal ganglion. The spinal ganglion is going to be a collection of nerve cells, the actual bodies of neurons, and it's going to be dealing with information, as you'll see later on. And then when the dorsal and ventral, or the posterior and anterior root, when they come together to exit out of the vertebral region, they come together into what we call a spinal nerve. Okay, so let me ink this out here, erase all this stuff so we can review here. So We have white matter, which are the axons. We have the gray matter, which are the cell bodies. We have the posterior or dorsal root and the anterior or ventral root. This is where information's coming into or out of the spinal cord. As I indicate here at the top, sensory information is going to come from the body, and it's going to come through the posterior or dorsal root, and it's going to go to the spinal cord. So that's going into it. Whereas going out of the spinal cord will be the motor output, and that will go to your glands, skin, or muscles. So your motor output is going to go out in this kind of fashion. So there is directionality to how things are flowing into and out of the spinal cord. It's very highly organized as to how things are coming in and out. So remember, sensory information comes in through the posterior root, and then motor information goes through the anterior root. Well, how does the spinal nerve exit the vertebrae? Well, there is an intervertebral foramen, okay, which is from a side view. You can see the little foramen right here. I guess if I highlighted it might be a little bit better. So you can see the intervertebral foramen right there and right there. So that's where your spinal nerves are going to be coming out. So you can see the intervertebral foramen right here, and you can see the spinal nerve as it's exiting out of that particular region. Now, just as the brain was protected by all kinds of membranes or meninges, the spinal cord is as well. So covering the inside surface and protecting and nourishing the spinal cord will be the pia mater, and it's a thin membrane over the top of it, and it helps to nourish and protect. The arachnoid mater is next, and that's in between the dura mater and the pia mater, and there's some spaces in there where cerebral spinal fluid will bathe these particular parts. The dura mater is very tough, and so it's the outermost layer covering the spinal cord. But notice it also covers spinal nerves, so your dorsal and anterior roots, and then it comes over and covers as a connective tissue layer. It covers those particular parts, and so that's a pretty important role that it plays in protecting and being a tough connective tissue layer over the surface of both the spinal cord and the spinal nerves that come out. So you can see the top view up here shows you the gray matter. It shows you the white matter. We can see the anterior rootlets coming out, or the anterior root coming out. You know, it will branch into rootlets as it goes into the spinal cord, but the root is an important part. The anterior root, posterior root is a pretty important part to know as well, because that will tell you, if sensory information is coming in or motor commands are going out. They do come together to form that spinal nerve, okay? And there is ganglion that we'll bring up later on. These are just collections of little nerve cell bodies, nerve cell bodies that are collected in that particular area for processing information. Okay, now this is a transverse view. You always have to orient yourself. So here's the anterior and here's the posterior. Okay, so if you see the anterior, then you'll know that the anterior root is on that side, and then you can see the posterior root is going to be on the opposite side. It's not labeled in this diagram, but if I change my pen here, so this would be the posterior root down here. Of course, they do come together to form the spinal nerve, so as it comes out, it does form the spinal nerve. But as you can see in this particular diagram, the spinal nerve, after it exits, it's going to become several different things. It's going to become the anterior ramus. The anterior ramus is going to basically take out and be the connecting cord to serve the front of the body. The posterior ramus is basically going to take information, both motor and sensory information, and communicate it to the spinal cord, but serve the back of the body. And I have a picture that will come up in just a second that will aid you in understanding that a little bit better. But the spinal nerve does bifurcate into major parts. The anterior ramus is one part that services front. Posterior ramus is going to be coming off and going dorsal and servicing the back. We also have the autonomic sympathetic ganglion. So we have branches that come off, and these are actually called white and gray ramuses, or rami. And these are going to be part of what we call the autonomic nervous system that is going to service your organs of your body and allow the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system have exert some kind of control over it. Typically, though, the sympathetic nervous system is using this, and the parasympathetic uses cranial nerves. So we'll see that in when we do the autonomic nervous system later on this semester. Just to highlight another couple of things here, we do have you can see the dura mater, the arachnoid mater, and the pia mater. And you can see there are spaces there. There's a space, the subarachnoid space is in between the pia mater and the arachnoid mater, and it's full of cerebral spinal fluid. And there's an epidural space that's actually above. Let's see if I can highlight that for you. But there is an epidural space that's right above the dura mater that is a space that fluid collects in as well. That has clinical significance when you look at doing things like doing an epidural block. So we can, if you ever are pregnant one day and you get ready to deliver, you can actually have medication put into the epidural space, which will block the sensation, the sensation from sensory nerve cells sending pain signals to the brain. They do take and use a needle to, let me see if I can ink that out and use a lighter color. So they do have a needle here that they can stick through the openings between the vertebrae. You can see they have stuck this needle through, and in this particular needle they have a thread that they can thread a catheter in, and from that catheter they can hook it up to an IV and drip how much ever medicine they want to drip in there into that space. So the catheter is just a really small tube that drops into medicine. So wherever I drop medicine in, it'll block. It basically blocks the sensory nerve cells from sending information to the brain from that particular area. And we dump that medication in the epidural space, so we call this an epidural, and we use this for some surgeries that, and whatever downstream that those nerve services, they won't send sensory information about pain any further. Spinal anesthesia can also be injected into the spine to block pain. You can see in this particular one, they're taking a syringe and they're injecting the medication, the spinal anesthetic, directly into, in this area, they're doing, it's injected into the subarachnoid space. So just a different location. Now the subarachnoid space has cerebral spinal fluid, so you can see that that's going to diffuse and block the nerves as that travels through that cerebral spinal fluid. So that's a way that we can, instead of putting somebody under general anesthesia, we can use injected anesthesia into the specific areas to block specific regions of pain. Just to highlight, why would you not want to go under general anesthesia? Some people don't wake up from general anesthesia, and so there are complications from general anesthesia. Whereas if you can do some more local anesthesia, your chances are better from not getting hurt from that. Although there are complications to doing even the spinal anesthesia and the epidural block. Okay. So kind of going along with these tracks that I've shown you before, let me just orient you one more time. We have the anterior root coming down here. Here we have the dorsal root going through this way. Here's that spinal ganglion, that collection of spinal nerve cell bodies. So you can see that you have a branching here. We have the posterior ramus that's taking information. So we have the spinal nerve that's bifurcating into that ramus, that posterior ramus, and then the anterior ramus. Posterior ramus is carrying information to the back of your body, and the anterior ramus is going to carry information to the front of your body. And so it can carry, in this particular graphic, it's carrying sensory information, and so information can go in both directions through these particular nerves as they branch off. And you can see that the the white and gray ramus, these rami, these are carrying information that's going to be related, that's going to carry information to your organs, that's going to carry information in regards to the sympathetic nervous system having activity in those organs. Okay, and again, we're going to talk about that when we do the autonomic nervous system. But just as you can carry sensory information to and from the spinal cord, or to the spinal cord, excuse me, you can carry information, motor information as well. Now notice the sensory information is coming in through the posterior root, and you can see it's carrying information to the spinal cord. But the motor commands are coming out of the spinal cord, and they're going, here through the anterior root. They're coming to the through the spinal nerve, and you can see that they're going through the posterior ramus, and they're also going through the anterior ramus, so servicing the front of the body and servicing the back of the body through those particular cords. And you can also see that there is information going through the gray and white rami, and going down and servicing the organs and commanding the organs to do their jobs. These nerves are called mixed nerves because both motor and sensory nerves are utilizing these particular conduits. So each of these nerves is a mixed nerve carrying information. Notice the posterior root's not being used in this diagram because motor commands are being sent through the anterior root to the body. The posterior root carries the sensory information from the body to the spinal cord. So we do have great directionality in utilization of these nerves. It has to be really highly organized so that all the information gets communicated to the right location. I like this diagram I found on the internet because it highlights the how the information is communicated. So you can see that you have so this would be the dorsal root, and this would be the anterior root here. And let's see if I can use a better color here. It didn't really show up that well. Maybe use a green here. So we can see the dorsal root here, and we can see the anterior root here. They'll come together to make up the spinal nerve coming out. And you can see that it bifurcates and branches so that this particular part here, the dorsal section, the dorsal ramus or posterior ramus, is going to carry information to the back of the body, but the anterior or ventral ramus is going to carry information to the front of the body. Okay, so that's why that nerve has to bifurcate, so we can service the front of the body and we can service the back of the body. Okay, so showing you just a little different view here. This is still a transverse section, but what I wanted to do was to go over some of the anatomy of the spinal cord with you, so you can have some of the anatomical terms and understand those. So looking at the gray matter is going to have what we call the posterior horn. So remember, this is posterior up here, this is anterior down here. How do I know that? Because I can see the fissure there. That big fissure is in an anterior region. So we can see the posterior horn of the gray matter, we can see the lateral horn of the gray matter, and we can see the anterior horn of the gray matter. This is very significant because there are going to be certain nuclei or certain collections of nerve cells that are found only in the anterior region. So here we have the somatic and visceral parts of the sensory nuclei here in the posterior and lateral horn. And then in the lateral and anterior horn, we have motor nuclei that are going to send motor information to the brain. So remember, sensory information is being collected from the body and taken to the spinal cord, but motor information is being taken from the spinal cord and taken to the body. Okay, so everything's nice and organized in these posterior, lateral, and anterior horns. Okay, we'll come back to that in 1 second. Let me also talk to you about what's going on in that white matter. So the white matter is organized into the posterior white column. So this would be all this area right in here. We have the lateral white column, which is all of this particular material right here. And then we have, excuse me, that's a lateral white column. And then we have the anterior white column is all of this white matter here. Okay, now remember, white matter are the axons. They're the myelinated axons that are coming out of the from the body to the spinal cord, or from the spinal cord to the body. So we'll come back and talk about these particular anatomical regions, the anterior white column, lateral white column, and posterior white column, in just a minute. I want to take and switch gears over back to these posterior, lateral, and anterior horn regions. So specifically, I want to look at these motor, just to give you a sense that everything is highly organized. I want to look at these motor regions, these motor nuclei here. Actually, specifically, let me ink this out. Specifically, I want to look at these motor nuclei, the somatic motor nuclei. Just to give you a sense, a little taste of the complexity, these motor nuclei, the somatic motor nuclei, are going to be organized from a medial to a lateral direction. So let me get my pen here. So from a medial, so that's medial to a lateral direction, you have in this particular region the nuclei controlling the pectoral girdle muscles is going to be most medial, so it'll be in this region over here, most medially. Then the next organized muscle, let me go ahead and get my ink out here again and go back to a pen. Okay, so we have the pectoral girdle muscles are going to be the motor neurons that are going to control those, or their cell bodies are going to be located there. We then have the muscles of the upper arm are located right there. We have the muscles of the forearm are going to be located here, and then the motor neurons controlling the muscles of the fingers, they're all organized systematically in a medial to lateral organization, and all of the spinal cord is organized in such fashion all along all of its different divisions and length, along the length of it. So, and what's kind of cool down here, I highlighted it down here for you, is that the flexors and extensors are grouped together. So all flexors are grouped together, all extensors are grouped together that are controlling those portions of the body. So when I tell you that the spinal cord is really complex, it is super duper organized. Everything is organized systematically. And at this particular level, you know, I'm hoping you'll learn some of the anatomy and just some of the general organization. But when you go to that next level of anatomy, you're going to be seeing that, you know, more and more complexity, more and more details as your teachers teach you more and more of the complexity of how it's organized. This is just showing you a microscopic view of the spinal cord, so you can see the gray matter and the white matter and see how it's kind of organized in terms of the different the posterior horn, lateral horn, anterior horn, and you can see the various things like the fissure here. So the anterior median fissure. You can see the posterior median sulcus. So in the gray matter and white matter, things of that nature. Alright, so I told you that I'd tell you about those posterior, lateral, and anterior white columns, and here we'll talk about it just for 1 second. These columns, I want you to think of these columns as being, you know, connecting cords is what they essentially are. And there are tracks of nerve cords that go through the posterior, the lateral, and the anterior white column. So these tracks are going to carry information, and some of those tracks, if you look at the coding up here, the red represents descending tracks. That is taking information from, you know, the brain through the spinal cord, and the ascending tracks are carrying information from the spinal cord to the brain through, and they're colored blue in this particular region here. So you can see in the posterior white column, the anterior white column, and the lateral white column and the anterior white column, these have tracks, specific tracks of information that are going through them. And it's hard to get a sense of that in this transverse view of what I mean by that. So let me show you this particular picture here to show you just one particular corticospinal tract. So this is basically carrying information from the cortical regions of the brain, the motor cortex up here, and it's taking it through the spinal regions. So you can see that these particular regions of the brain, if they wanted to communicate to through the spinal cord to the body, there has to be highly coordinated tracts, nerve tracts, carrying specific information. And you can see just one nerve tract going through. It's going through various parts of those white columns, and you can see sometimes it splits, but it's always going through those white columns because that's the part of the spinal cord that carries information from the spinal cord to the brain and from the brain to the spinal cord. Now, this is very sophisticated, and you can see there's other different tracts carrying other different kinds of specific information. So where you see all these different areas, these are different tracts that go through the brain. I'm not going to show you a lot of those tracts just because I have to limit down what you're learning for this particular class since it's just an introduction. But I want you to appreciate the fact that these white columns, posterior, lateral, and anterior white columns, have tracts that go through them carrying specific information to specific areas of the brain, and every specific part of the brain that communicates information to the body has a different tract that it goes through. Okay, so when you talk about the spinal cord being complex, yes, it's very complex, having all these very specific tracts of information going through it and being coordinated. Okay, that's a little bit about the spinal cord. I want to talk about spinal nerves for just a minute. So if you remember back to studying the muscle was organized into, the whole muscle was organized into bundles called fascicles, and then each fascicle was made of individual muscle fibers or muscle cells. The organization of the spinal nerve is not much different. So if I take a look at the spinal nerve, so here's the little section that we're looking at, and you're basically blowing it up here. The spinal nerve is going to be made of blood vessels. They're going to be in between. If you look at the covering on the outside surface, this covering out here is going to be called the epineurium. So the epineurium covers the whole nerve and protects it. If we get down into looking a little bit deeper, we have a perineurium that's around a fascicle. So this particular thing right here is a fascicle. It's a bundle of axons from nerve cells. So the perineurium is going to cover the bundles, the fascicles. And in between each of those fascicles, there's going to be lots of blood vessels that are going to service and feed. There will even be nerves that are in there. There will be nerves that will service so that you can feel pain in your nerves. I know it's kind of weird to think that your nerves feel pain, but they do. If you take one fascicle and look at it, so if you take one fascicle and look at it, it's made of the myelinated axons. So you can see the Schwann cell here, but it's made of the myelinated axons of nerve cells. So we're talking lots and lots and lots of nerve cells coming through or sending their axons through these particular cords called nerves, or called spinal nerves. Covering each of the Schwann cells is going to be an endoneurium, just a protective covering over each of those particular structures. If we look at a kind of a micrograph of it, you can see the blood vessels there that you can see in between those nerve cells, and you can see the endoneurium. So this is the endoneurium covering one of the Schwann cells and axons. So you're talking lots and lots of nerves inside of that. This to me is a beautiful picture showing you several fascicles. So we have a fascicle that's here. You can see the fascicle is all this particular area here, and around the fascicle you'll have, of course, the perineurium. Around one of the Schwann cells axons you'll have an endoneurium. There's just one axon there. The epineurium covers the whole nerve. Of course, you have to have blood vessels to service all of this. This is a very energetic tissue, and you have to have blood vessels that go in and feed these things and carry blood away, for that matter. Switching gears one more time, I want to talk about dermatomes with you. A dermatome is a specific region of skin or your skin surface that's monitored by a single pair of spinal nerves. And this has clinical significance because damage or infection to that particular spinal nerve servicing that particular skin region will cause the loss of sensation to that whole dermatome region. These are your dermatomes. So if you look at dermatome for spinal nerve C2, C2 services all this particular area. So you knock out C2, it knocks out sensation to all that particular area. So there is a segment here at T4, there's a segment at T4 where you have a pair of spinal nerves that services that particular segment of your body. So your body is segmented into regions. If you look at L5, lumbar spinal nerve 5, there's a pair of them, and they service this particular region of your leg. So if you lost L5, you would lose sensation of that particular region there. So it's important that you understand that there are dermatomes, so that if a patient comes in and they have some kind of a loss of sensation in a particular area, you may be able to find that spinal nerve and understand that spinal nerve and maybe be able to diagnose a condition. What I like about studying the dermatomes is by studying shingles, you can see dermatomes. So in shingles, your spinal nerves get infected with the chicken pox virus, and whatever region that it affects that particular nerve and inflames that nerve, you get blistering that will occur in that particular dermatome of your body. So there is a shingles vaccine. They just came out with a brand new one that's supposed to be even more effective than the one they had before. And people that had chickenpox as a youngster still have latent virus inside their body, and because when you get older, your immune system can kind of shut down and stop protecting you from that virus. That virus can come and inflame and infect for some reason it comes and inflames and infects your spinal nerves. And in older people, especially older than 65, a lot of times they'll get shingles, and sometimes it's mild, sometimes it's really nasty. But it'll affect a section of the body because it only affects one particular spinal nerve. And after 50 years of age, you might think about getting a shingles vaccine because just about everybody's exposed to chickenpox, and it's possible to get that particular condition. I'm not going to beat these plexuses to death, but you do have in certain areas like the cervical region, the lumbar region, we have a plexus of nerves, and it's probably the reason we probably have a plexus of nerves is because we have some very complex regions of our body where we have lots of in this particular one, the cervical plexus is servicing all the arm muscles and the neck muscles, and because they're very complex, we have and there's lots of different muscles. There is an interweaving of nerves to service those particular regions. This is just showing you the cervical plexus, and I'm not going to make you know all the different regions there and everything that it serves, but it is interesting to look at what this plexus of nerves does service, and to appreciate just the sheer beauty of how it services all those particular regions. So there are. Let's see if I like this picture. I like this picture better. It's a little bit more simplified. So there are, as the nerves come out of the spinal cord, there are regions to it. So, for example, the anterior rami roots are going to be in purple here. They then divide into trunks. So we have major trunks here, superior, middle, and inferior trunks. And then they divide into divisions. So we can see the divisions here. And then they divide into cords. So you can see this lateral, posterior, medial cords. And then the peripheral nerves actually come out. And so we have lots of different nerves that come out. Some of the more important ones for the arm, these peripheral nerves, would be like the radial, the median, and the ulnar, and the musculocutaneous nerves. These nerves are pretty important to understand clinically because you don't want to take a needle and stick it into, if you're doing an injection into somebody, into their deltoid region, you want to make sure you know where those nerves are located and you're not going to puncture one of those nerves. That can be very detrimental. When you're doing various blood taking and things, or just knowing, like when you see a person that has some kind of nerve damage, it's important that you know these nerves and understand what they service. I think it's kind of cool that all this information is collected in these cords and taken to very specific regions of the body. It's all mapped out when you're an embryo and then a fetus growing. All these cords have to be in the right place to service the right area of the body. This is just kind of cool, showing you a map that the median nerve is going to service these particular regions, the ulnar nerve services these regions, the radial nerve services these particular regions. So each nerve services a region. When you get damage to a nerve, there's going to be damage to that particular region. So knowing that the ulnar nerve services this region, if a person ever got a tingling or loss of sensation in this particular part of their hand, it may give you an indication what nerve is being damaged. These are what nerves look like in a cadaver, just to show you what those look like there. The lumbar plexus, again, services the lumbar, the sacral, and the leg regions. These are there's lots of complex muscles there, and that's why we have all these nerves. And again, they're organized into roots and divisions and nerves and such. And this is just showing you some of the cool nerves coming off your lumbar region and some of the areas that they serve over there. Sacral plexus, again, is servicing a lot of leg muscles. So because we have so many muscles, we have a plexus of nerves there. And it's just a beautiful network. Sometimes these nerves can get pinched and cause various kinds of problems like sciatica. And again, just showing you, some of the nerves and what they service. There's a beautiful network of nerves that comes out of the sacral and lumbar plexi, and they branch and branch and branch, and they can become some pretty major nerves. The femoral nerve is pretty big. When you get a gunshot wound or a broken leg, you do worry about these nerves being severed. We have the sciatic nerve is a huge nerve that goes down and services the leg. And you can see just a branching there. So it is important to know nerves because of broken bones. You want to know what nerves could be severed, and when we do break bones, we try to immobilize them so they don't cut and do more damage to arteries, veins, and the nerves. And this is just showing you the saphenous nerve servicing this region, the fibular nerve serving this region, the sural nerve serving this region, tibial nerve services this region. So it's kind of cool that there is essentially a whole map of the human in your nerves. So there's nerves that service very specific locations of the body, and when they're damaged, they can have there's major consequences for that. Okay, so let's wrap this up talking about reflexes for a minute. There are different kinds of reflexes. They can be classified by, developmental reflexes. So we do have innate reflexes that are genetically determined. Some developmental reflexes are acquired later on, and you have to learn those. Okay, so a genetically determined reflex would be something like a sucking reflex. You come born ready to suck milk. You don't have to learn that. It becomes better as you do it, but it is an innate reflex that you come with. Some of the response reflexes, you have somatic reflexes. These are going to be reflexes that control skeletal muscle contractions. And then we also have visceral or autonomic reflexes that control actions of smooth muscles, cardiac muscles, and glands. So we do have lots of different kinds of reflexes. We can classify reflexes based on the complexity of the circuit. So some of these reflexes are what we call monosynaptic. There's only one synapse. You have a sensory neuron that's connected to a motor neuron, and it creates a reflex. We can have polysynaptic, where you have multiple synapses. This is where you'd have a sensory nerve cell, an inner nerve cell, and a motor nerve cell in sequence connected together. And then the processing site, you do have spinal reflexes that are processed by the spinal cord, and there are cranial reflexes that are processed by the brain. Just to give you a sense of a reflex, so here we have the arrival of a stimulus. Here we stuck your hand on a tack. There is a receptor that receives that information and activates a sensory neuron. Notice it's using the posterior root to get to the spinal cord. In this particular one, this is a polysynaptic reflex. The information processing is going to be done by the interneuron here in the spinal cord. It's going to then use the anterior root to send a motor command through a motor neuron to an effector, which will be a muscle here to cause you to pull your hand back, and then you'll get the response there. So we do use sensory neurons in this one, we use interneurons, and we use motor neurons in this particular spinal reflex. Just showing you again, here we have the sensory receptor, we have the sensory neuron, we have the interneuron. It's going to process the information. Motor neuron is going to send information to the effector to cause you to have an activity. So this is the patellar. This is the patellar reflex, and this is using a stretch reflex. So we do have inside of our muscles, we have these muscle spindles, which are sensory organs that can sense when muscles stretch. Okay, and they can send information to the brain. So if I hit with a hammer here, if I hit a stretch receptor, there's that muscle spindle that's in there that can actually send information through a sensory neuron. And in this one, we have a monosynaptic reflex here, where there's only one synapse. It goes specifically to the effector and causes a contraction to occur. So I wanted to show you a monosynaptic reflex there, and that's the patellar. We have lots of these where you can hit with little hammers, different regions. A stretch receptor will catch that information or sense that information, use a sensory neuron, and then a motor neuron to have that reflex activity. So this one is a polysynaptic, so we have a painful stimulus, it comes through, interneuron processes information, and then we have information that will go out. Oftentimes in these reflexes, not only do we send a positive message, we send a negative message. We say, hey, some muscles need to not contract, so we send signals for those muscles not to contract. Then we send information that takes a little bit of time to the central nervous system of the brain to sense the pain. Okay, so before you feel anything painful, you're basically going to release, and then the pain will come later as the information gets to the brain. Again, just seeing you step on a painful stimulus, sensory neuron sends information to the interneuron commands the motor neuron. It also commands negative signals so that it will inhibit certain muscles not to contract, and then that information for pain will go to the brain. Okay, just showing it one more time, just the patellar or knee-jerk reflex. Okay, my friends, that's a pretty complex lecture. You might have to go back and look at certain segments, but that gives you a sense of the anatomy and some of the functioning of the spinal cord. It's a beautiful, complex, anatomical region of the body, highly organized, very sophisticated, and do everything you can to protect your spinal cord, because when it's cut, there's a lot of dysfunction that occurs beyond that point. Well, I will see you next time. I hope that you have learned something, and like I said, go back and watch some of the segments of it if you didn't understand it the first time. So make sure you keep on your study guides, keep up on your reading, keep up on your material that you need. We don't have too much further to go before this particular class ends, so make sure you end well. With that being said, I wish you a good day.